Okay, so let's maximize this here. Just gonna move this one. I'm using a borrowed computer, and it's quite amazing to have something that doesn't take about $200 in different dongles to connect. I'm amazed by old technology. So, kicking this conference off is interesting, but also a difficult challenge because of the scope of my research. And I want to cover just a little bit about myself and about my work, just to give some context into what I do and why I do what I do. At Columbia, I've primarily been working with journalists and people that work in media rather than working with other academics, which is exciting, but it's also exhausting. So for the past several years, I've been working with reporters, I've been working with public relations people just to understand more about the data aspects and the structural aspects that are behind a lot of the news events, the unfortunate terror events, the amplification aspects of propaganda, misinformation. And for the past year or so, I also had been working on the report commissioned by the Senate Intelligence Committee. So this was the report on the foreign election interference. I did most of the Instagram work. I wasn't focused on Twitter, but I was very much looking more at the Facebook and Instagram and the meme component. So my undergraduate background is in science. So a lot of what I'm going to show, a lot of the images and mapping mechanisms that I'm going to show, really the methodology comes more from ecology and biological systems, I would say, than traditional communication networks. But I think this is very important to look at these problems from interdisciplinary perspectives, so not just political science, but structural. So I'm going to show the evolution of my research on misinformation propaganda, but I'm going to do it through where I started, and just to go back to 2016. I've been working on this for years, this type of data analysis. Before 2016, I would say that I was focused on the positive aspects of social media, the benefits of social media in terms of disaster responses. One of my case studies in my PhD was looking at the response to the Japanese tsunami, the earthquake, and the better things that happened. And I think that it started to turn in 2015 or 2016 towards, I guess, unfortunately, research that was more focused on the aftermath or the negative associations of social media, or social media not necessarily for bad, but the unanticipated consequences of social media, and not just social media, but technology in general. So I saw this bumper sticker recently, just a few days ago, and it was on a car. I found a Flickr version of it, but it says, "Be nice to America or we'll bring democracy to your country." I almost think this bumper sticker could be repurposed into or remixed into "Be nice to America or we'll bring technology into your country." So moving along here, so in November of 2016, I was very interested in understanding not just what Facebook had done, or not just what Google or Twitter or any platform had done, but I was looking at the beginning of what people were distributing as fake news list or list of unreliable sources, hyper-partisan sources. So I took the time to crawl several hundred websites and make a network map out of it. And I was surprised to see that just the impact of these small blog type sites, WordPress sites, sites that most people have never heard of, but just the number of links and the sheer quantity of SEO manipulation and redirection that was coming in. Most of these things were coming back into sites like YouTube. So I was very surprised only to see that Facebook was part of this ecosystem of misinformation and political bias, but that YouTube was almost at the center of a lot of this, or as in my opinion, it seemed like it was a destination or the more of an end destination than Facebook, which is often used for amplification. So I made this this graph visualization. Almost broke my computer. Probably, I mean, my graph programs probably crashed 1,000 times while I was trying to make this. But this was published in The Guardian as a full-color network visualization, which in my life I've never to this day seen a newspaper willing to actually put this into a Sunday version of the paper as full color. So this began my quest into trying to understand more, not just about a platform, but more about the structural ecosystem and the ways and the pathways that people find not just content, but similar-minded opinions and views, amplification of biased views. And so kind of moving on, I expanded this network into partisan sources. So I colored political sites or sites that dealt with political news that tended to swerve right and left, and mapped out the ecosystem and really found that a lot of the more extreme, more polarized, conservative or far right were very much populating Wikipedia, a lot of the public resources, and you can see this, not just through quantity, but also through the presence of all these sites around YouTube, Wikipedia, and really public resources. And this is a tactical map, I guess, in a way, because it shows the inefficiency of what I would say are more liberal or even more center media to kind of participate in these public forums that are online, especially YouTube and especially Wikipedia, which is often left out of a lot of the conversations that we talk about. We talk about platforms, but I think that Wikipedia is a major part of this ecosystem, as you can see. And in other senses, I think that sites like Russia Today, which often get a lot of criticism, I'm not so sure about the impact of this. I know there's amplification, I know there's a focus on these, but I consider a lot of these sites that are state-sponsored as more of known entities, and I think that it's often better in some ways to focus on the lesser-known entities and the hidden things that are operating behind these ecosystems. This is a link map, so this includes not just Twitter pages or Facebook pages. It's the whole gamut of actors and linking into a news ecosystem. One of the things that's interesting about this is that Donald Trump, his Twitter account is right here. So Trump's Twitter was actually around the election time of the the 2016 election. His Twitter account was actually kind of positioned in between some of the most important, I would say, left-wing or center-left media, which is a very, very interesting result of this map. And New York Times, this also has to do with linking patterns, because New York Times will typically link internally. So they're kind of separated in the link ecosystem away from the other media. And Washington Post often does the same. They link internally, they link to themselves, they don't often link to other. So I think these are some of the problems that we need to be more aware of, or that we need to look at in greater detail as we move along. And most of these things are structural, and most of these things are ecological. So I'll also share this presentation afterwards. So once I made that map, I went back in and I crawled the same sites to look and see the trackers. So there are different tools to use for understanding more about the tracker ecosystem. But if you can see on I'll just move it a little bit, zoom in here. So all sorts of ad tracking going on. I think that a lot of people here are aware of the different ad tracking mechanisms, and I would almost call it behavioral tracking. But the Facebook like, more or less, was at the center, and a lot of people study this. I'm very aware here. But at the center of all of this tracking and all of this emotional contagion was really the Facebook like, so at least for 2016. And one of the better examples of this is that one of my favorite findings of this, when I went to these sites to see which things were that were connected into Facebook, were things like, would you like to see Hillary in prison? Click like if you agree, which of course is recorded back, and pulls other members of your Facebook network into people who can be targeted. So it's more of this shadow. There's an underside. We study social media and we study hashtag networks and we study different types of networks, but I think there's a very important underside of this network that exists, and this is the example of what I call the shadow tracking or the shadow network of the surface. So when I look at ecosystems, I often don't focus on content. So content is sometimes a black hole because we can study content, but it's very, very important to understand where the sources and how this information is getting amplified, distributed, remixed, intermediated. And so going back into some of these sites from the original graph, one of the first things that I found with a deeper dive into some of the YouTube links was a network of about 80,000 what seemed like, I'm not going to use the word AI, it was clearly automated. While I was pulling data from the YouTube API, more of these videos were coming up. They were called ATs. They were linked to a nondescript small Silicon Valley company with basically a PO box. And these were going up by the hundreds. So while I was even pulling the data, why this was not a YouTube API violation, I have no idea. Even the last time I checked, about half of these channels were taken down. But this is just clear manipulation. And they didn't have a lot of views, but it was a very geopolitical-oriented network that focused on not just Trump, but European Union, French economy. It was targeting the French elections. This is coming into 2017. And we can look at these things in more detail, but what I assume this type of network is something that would interfere with the recommendations that you would get as you're typing, so YouTube autocomplete recommendations as you search, or possibly even Google. So these things were transcribed. So what this system was doing was it was pulling other content and essentially scraping content from other news articles, putting them together, and then reading this off in a computer-type voice, and then spooling out a video. So it had a double impact. It had a transcript behind it, and it also had, but this network was it was fascinating. These things are not that hard to find if you're looking in the right places. So this gets into the case of platform responsibility. You can have all sorts of mechanisms for content moderation, but sometimes you can just do a search, and I think this is where some of the platforms there's a common sense approach to some of these problems that they tend to avoid because they want to build more complex structures to deal with this. So again, moving back to different explorations through structural maps and network maps, I looked back using IBM Watson when I still had the access. It was amazing at the time, but I pulled all the tweets from the Philip Howard did a study on the top hashtags for Trump and the top hashtags for Clinton during the election, and I pulled all the tweets, and what I started to see was that there was a hugely oversized impact of a very select few accounts that were just absolutely dominating the conversation. And this is where you get into the point where of a point of agency or of user agency. So back when I was studying my PhD, it was empowering that social media and new media gave users agency. But I think that agency has very much been co-opted by amplification mechanisms. So these were some of these Twitter accounts at the time. These had one of them had 2.5 million tweets. It had tweeted, and so they're skirting the boundaries of the limitations of Twitter's API and very much automating conversations. So to outsize impact, not only to dominate trends, but also to manipulate what would be or what would appear to be popular opinion about topics and conversations. Of course, a lot of this targeted journalists. So as we look through different platforms, I think that the purposes and the functions of each platform are very, very important to consider. When we talk about Twitter, we should really very much think about how to contextualize it in the fact of who it's targeting and the kinds of audiences that it's targeting, because not everyone uses Twitter. So as we move on here, again, going back into some of these maps and some of these structures, I did a deeper network crawl of that original graph that I started with and started to really understand more about the tracking, right? So it's not just Facebook, it's not just Google, but the entire ecosystem of media, not just social media, is essentially structured around monetization and data tracking and data profiling. But through mapping and through innovative network techniques, while we still have API access, I don't know how long some of these things are gonna last. Instagram shut down their public API just a few months ago. So while we still have access, it's innovative methods and using forensic techniques can really tell us more about not just the content, but the reasons and the motivations and the structures and the financial structures that support this type of ecosystem. As you can see, double click here, which is Google or was bought by Google, is very much at the center of some of the worst of the partisan sites or of the highly partisan fringe sites. So again, I'm really trying to reinforce approaching this type of study through a network analysis and through a structural perspective, and just giving examples of very interesting things that I've done. I have all the trackers, so I captured all the trackers. I put it into a 500-page PDF if anyone wants to download it, and you can see the 3,000 individual trackers. So again, just showing the impact and the outsized influence of automation, not just bots, but what I would call rally networks and what I would call organizational amplification. You can see this. This is an Instagram hashtag network for one of the Internet Research Agency accounts. But when I was working at Amsterdam, what we started to see, and we captured and archived all of this, is that there are third-party, so at the time, Instagram doesn't really have a retweet function. So it creates a major vulnerability in the network. So there have been all sorts of what I would call shady third-party apps that you can install, of course with scary user permissions, that allow for redistribution of messages. And two of the biggest ones in recent memory in the past couple of years, one of them is called Regran and the other is called Repost App. And it's fascinating to see just how much impact these have. So when Instagram went and deleted a lot of the Russian content, because of how these apps work, anything that was reposted by these two extensions or third-party apps that linked into Instagram remained. So they were not deleted. So as we move on, again, we have to think about how this system comes together and how especially automation influences, and I don't want to use the word bots because I'm almost tired of talking about bots. The most influential automation networks are typically what I would call cyborgs. So they come from human coordination through different automated tools, often interfaced through APIs. And I know they're cracking down, which has privacy benefits in some cases, but is very bad for researchers still. So looking at these different, I've gone platform to platform and looked across to see how these things come together and how to better understand the impacts through metrics, but also through reach and through the surfacing of certain types of content, which has, in some cases, disturbed the assumptions that we just think about things like election interference or media bias. So again, last year I was given the chance by NBC to work with them on a data set of about 40,000 Russian tweets. So when I expanded thousands and thousands of links, what I found was that the most linked to news entities from all of this Russian activity, the second most linked source was the Washington Post, which you wouldn't assume that these entities are trying to link back to what I would mainstream arguably liberal media outlets. So, and you see RT on here, but RT is really much at the tail end of this. So when you look at this, you start to understand that reaching people and reaching citizens for political information often is local. It's often very much issue-based, racial, and again, we start to see that these operations not just they're not trying to push things out through RT. It's a very sophisticated mechanism and very well-timed mechanism to push certain issues and legitimize themselves with specific audiences at certain times for the opportunistic ability to push wedge issues when they need to. So they connect with local audiences, retweeting regular news until the time comes when they need to push out something that would be divisive or what I would call a wedge issue. So going back to YouTube as the center of the structural ecosystem, again, last year I crawled the crisis actor, which was a theme that came up directly after the horrific Florida Parkland shooting. So crisis actor has also been a conspiracy term for quite a while, but what I wanted to do was I wanted to map the structures of what this looked like, or what this map looked like across the entire YouTube ecosystem, and what it was connecting people to who were looking for something like crisis actor or David Hogg, who was one of the targets of this. So I collected the next up videos, which are essentially, they're at the end of the video, but they're also, if you have autoplay on, these are the videos that'll come up. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but some of the recommendations that I was getting, or for videos that would come up after a regular or NBC debunking of a conspiracy about crisis actors, were things like truth or dare with rape. So, PewDiePie comes in here. Crisis actor, it shows them rehearsing or claims that they're rehearsing. Illuminati, but the network was, I believe, the most interesting part of this. So this connects people who are looking for facts and for truth directly with things like Pizzagate, Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, things going back all the way to the 90s and 80s. So again, we can debunk things and we can fact check, but unless we better understand the structural ecosystem behind this and how things are playing, it's very important to know more about the larger context of a lot of these initiatives, such as fact-checking, that try to push truth. Satanic slaves, again, it's pedophilia, so you get into very scary. What I also found in this crisis actor, which is a continuing case when you look at YouTube, is that at the time InfoWars was a kind of a hub of the conspiracy ecosystem, which isn't surprising, but it is surprising in the case of a news event such as the Parkland shooting. So moving on quickly, one of my more recent data explorations was looking at the Caravan network, or the claimed Caravan and the George Soros attack that happened last year. And through mapping, we can see so much more about why, such as the results on the right, what they look like from a structural perspective. So I was basically almost doxxed after I posted this because people were angry about this. But again, I don't have the ability, or researchers currently do not have the ability to look at hashtags on Instagram unless we manually scrape, which will violate typically the terms of service if you publish a large-scale research study, or it can be debunked. They can say, oh, actually, the data that you collected is not true. So in terms of democracy and in terms of participation, I really think that most of the platforms, mostly American, they start out with a good purpose, and they start out with virtue, and they start out with a mission to have a positive impact. And these are written into you can look at the old YouTube before they sold to Google. You can look at the statements made by founders. But I think that once they reach a size, or once they go public, there's a very quick transition into profit models and making sure their business model is correct. And YouTube is a very much a good example of that, because the first penalty that you have as a creator is typically demonetization, or they'll take away your premium demonetization. So moving along here, another example of this is that I just wanted to do an A to Z search of Google to see what recommendations came up to kind of support this hypothesis. And so I went through every letter of the alphabet, and it was just fascinating because 98% of what came up as the recommendations were commercial, right? Like they're not informative, they're not fact-based, but they were actually commercial. So I published this, and this is kind of rudimentary, but it's very informative into how to better understand. So I think that this investigative forensics in these kinds of ways, unconventional in some cases, can tell us a lot about how this system works. And I'll move quick because I don't have much time. This is kind of what I've explained. When platforms are mediating our social interactions, but not just mediating, really supporting the infrastructure that provides us with the ability to interact. This is really the core problem, or the fundamental problem, when we talk about modern democracy. So again, I'm going to move a little bit faster here. So I think that populism really is, it's been enabled by platforms, right? But not in productive or healthy ways. So I can't get into I don't even want to get into the free speech because of the problems with America's Section 230. But I know that legal implications, especially there was a case in Canada, I think it was published yesterday, for defamation or against a Muslim restaurant owner. So I think that when the penalties become large enough and the deterrences from government and from regulation become large enough, I think that there will be change eventually. But whether that's a $30 billion fine on Facebook, sometimes it might, in some cases, go too far, for Germany, for example. But I think that we have to monitor and we have to understand more, as researchers especially, about how the structural implications of these platforms and why we get the results and why we get the outcomes and why we are connected. So again, moving to the last couple of slides here. What I've been working on the past 6 months is understanding more about, we've been looking at Muslim targeting and harassment, and I spent months capturing tweets, any mention or any reference of some of the candidates, such as Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. And by looking at these maps, I think I can zoom in here, we can see, and this is actually a dynamic graph. I didn't have time to animate it or didn't want to try to get animate it, but we can see who these armies and how these tactical maneuvers work for essentially media manipulation and attacks. So this is Laura Loomer, and I believe she was suspended recently from Instagram. But to look at this in animated form, it's incredible, because you can see the pathways and how this nervous system of media originates, and where the other, such as celebrities, like there's Bette Midler in here, when they come in and get brought into the conversation. So again, structural components on ecosystem, and not just looking at the end content, but looking at how these things originate and the pathways that expose regular users and citizens, I would call them, to these problems are huge. So I think that I will probably stop there because I only have about 1 minute left and time is up. So perfect. And I'm happy to answer any more questions during the Q&A. Thank you.